to talk about these important topics. And while we need to adapt to certain impacts that will happen anyway, there are certain impacts that we cannot adapt to. They will be crossing too many dangerous thresholds and causing too much damage to the planet that we just cannot allow to happen. We need to mitigate. We need to take measures to cut carbon emissions. So this is what we're going to discuss, this mix of adaptation and mitigation. And there are some opportunities, economic opportunities, that could help with mitigation and finding good solutions. So I'd like to introduce now the chair of this discussion, Professor Achim Steiner, who is the UN Undersecretary General and Executive Director of the UN Environmental Program. Professor Steiner was previously Director General of the UN office at Nairobi. And before joining UNEP, he served as Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. He has worked with both grassroots and also the highest levels of international policymaking to address the interface between environmental sustainability, social equity, and economic development. And I'd like to invite him here on the stage to take over the discussion. Professor Steiner.
Thank you very much, Ralita. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be up here with a very eminent panel with the unenviable task of trying to facilitate and moderate a group of people who could speak to you for hours from their experience, their knowledge, their scars in terms of climate negotiations and processes. But above all, the idea this afternoon is, and that was my appeal also to all our distinguished speakers, is to tie and pull some of the threads together that surround the climate process, be it in terms of the mitigation and adaptation agenda, be it also in terms of the logic of acting on climate change in terms of the development agenda, and how actions, not only in terms of linking mitigation and adaptation, make sense, but also how the climate response is part of a development response. 2015 is a dramatic year for climate change, but actually also a dramatic year for development. It's also a dramatic year in the sense of recalibrating some of the climate discussions and hopefully outcomes ultimately when it comes to mitigation adaptation. We saw some of that in Lima. The call to action made it very clear that while mitigation is a key element of the response to carbon emissions, adaptation is increasingly a critical part of countries' ability to even be in a position to respond. Some of you may be aware of the adaptation gap report that UNEP released in the margins of Lima, a first as yet rough attempt to try and begin to get an order of magnitude of what it actually means to countries to begin to adapt to global warming and its consequences to climate change. The numbers are mind-boggling in many ways. For any finance minister, they would be nothing short of an alarm bell. And yet, the discussion about climate change, and this is my last opening remark before I invite Naoko in a moment to give us the first keynote, is at a point where we have to interpret the response to climate change not only in terms of the threat, but increasingly to interpret our actions in terms of choices we make in understanding the risks, but also the opportunities of acting. And herein perhaps lies the greatest hope for 2015, to be understood as a year in which we focus less and less on that which divides us as nations, as communities, as sectors, as industries, as economies, and focus more on the benefits of a collective response to climate change. With these introductory remarks, let me now turn to Naoko Ishii, who is the GEF Chief Executive and Chairperson, known to many of you also from her years with the World Bank and before that with the government of Japan. Naoko, it is my great pleasure to invite you to address the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Achim. Very good afternoon to everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Achim has asked me to talk about transformational change. It's a great start because transformational change is absolutely required to mitigate the climate change challenges. And the good news is that as far as mitigation is concerned, we come to know more about where the fundamental transformation is required, and even we have started to catalyze some transformational actions on the ground in some of the key systems. As former President Calderon, who addressed to us yesterday, argued in the new climate economy report, we need fundamental transformations in 3 key economic systems. We need to change the world urban systems, we need to change the world land use system, and we need to change the world energy systems. And one of the key messages from that report is that achieving sustainable growth is possible while addressing climate change challenges. So the growth and climate change mitigation are not either or. If we do it right, we can have both. This is a very positive message from that report. Let me maybe share with you what I see, what's going on in each of those 3 key economic systems the report identified. As for cities, there is increasing recognition of the role played by cities. Here in India, Prime Minister Modi announced 100 Smart Cities initiative, and there are emerging number of sustainable city programs, including ours too, that know how to help mayors or the city managers to design their cities in a much more comprehensive, integrated way so that the city can be more livable in the longer future. As for the land use change, one of the big ticket items is to take the deforestation out of supply chain of global commodity such as palm oil, beef, and soy. As maybe Peter can confirm, production of these commodities are responsible for about 80% of tropical deforestation. We have been working together, as mentioned yesterday, also Unilever, that the Chief Sustainable Officer, to bring all stakeholders together along the entire supply chain, from smallholder farmers to manufacturers to wholesalers and consumers. The third area of key systems we need a transformational change is the energy. And here I see maybe the most advanced area and very good innovative program to support the both energy efficiency and renewable energy. For example, that our program in China has helped leverage more than 1 billion through grant financing to reduce the risk of private sector investment in energy, in utilities, and also through support for the policy framework in renewable energy, which is conducive for low carbon investment. So all in all, we have lots of good examples in those key areas. Our challenge ahead of us is to how to scale up those good examples so that we can have a systemic impact on the ground. A story looks somehow different in adaptation. In some sense, adaptation is more complex than mitigation. It's more complex because adaptation is fundamentally more localized than mitigation. Appropriate adaptation measures are very specific to the geography, to the sector, and to the ecosystem which is being targeted. So when it comes to adaptation, there is not one single price, like the price of carbon in the case of mitigation, which can drive the systemic change. But still, adaptation is so critical for sustainable development. So there is no clear-cut, analytical, or policy framework for adaptation yet, which in my view is kind of established in case of mitigation. However, just in the experience of the GEF of investing more than 1 billion for the last couple of years in adaptation, I think there may be few factors which could help and critical for solid adaptation response. Let me just briefly mention 4 factors. The first is adequate data and information. It is vital that we produce a best possible mapping of risk exposure and carefully analyze likely options. Recent release of spatial information from NASA, high-resolution spatial data from NASA can be absolutely helpful. Second, planning and budgeting. We must support governments to assign the cost of various adaptation options. City and state planners need to know where to put a development, where to select the industrial site, and which are the critical natural resources to be conserved, to be protected, and restored. Third, the private sector investment is vital. In order to strengthen the resilience of our economy, it's necessary that private sector factor in the need of adaptation in their decision-making. In recent project in Morocco, for instance, we have helped the private sector investment in port against the storm flood. The last point, lastly, that we need to strengthen disaster risk preparedness. This involves both improving the public sector, its ability to respond to natural disasters, including budgeting adequately for contingent liability, but also insurance companies have to be increasingly prepared to take the fair share of the cost of climate-related disasters. We will hear more from Mr. Domichi about the Sendai the conference. So in closing, let me just repeat, in the coming decades, both strong mitigation and solid adaptation are absolutely critical to ensure that development can live up to its potential in a sustainable manner. Thank you so much.
Naoko, thank you very much. I know it is always challenging to try and compress a whole theory and also reflection in practice into a few minutes, but thank you for kicking us off. I immediately turn to somebody who finds himself now as Secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change at the center of perhaps one of the most substantive and far-reaching rethinks of India's approach to dealing with both climate change, but also the acceleration of development, of access to energy, and at the same time maintaining the environmental sustainability dimension of India's future economy and natural resources. Ashok, we spent also this morning some time talking about the full spectrum of climate change issues, perhaps also given that we have an international audience from all over the world here, through your eyes and lens, both from the ministry specifically, but also India's approach to the issue of climate change, mitigation, adaptation. Some of your reflections, please. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that I'm extremely conscious that the clock is ticking. And in more sense than one, because the IPCC report does say that the clock is ticking for the whole world. And I also find that somebody else has consumed my 1 minute. So I will bear the indulgence. I will bear the indulgence of the chair and the audience. But what we've been hearing since yesterday, probably more than 100 times, is that 2015 is an extremely critical year. And it is a critical year because either by design or by default, the world is charged with the responsibility of finalizing the Sustainable Development Goals as also the Climate Change Agreement. But I think it's a very fortuitous coincidence, and it provides the world a very powerful opportunity to demonstrate the resolve to balance the need for development and the need to have a clean environment. Indeed, recognize that how the right to development and how the right to environment can coexist. It is in this sense that I think the outcome of the Lima call for action is welcome, because it restores some of the fundamental issues that concerns climate change and which are indeed a source of major action in developing countries. India has played a very proactive role, and I think we are determined to continue to play a proactive role so that we have a positive and pragmatic agreement in Lima. Now, the action which India is taking, and I'm focusing on the two subjects, adaptation and mitigation. Incidentally, as I said, adaptation has been restored and it has been given a prime place in the Lima call for action. We have about 8 missions which we have already launched for several years. 2 of them are very clearly directed towards mitigation, and the others are missions which are directed towards adaptation. The water mission, the agriculture mission for sustainable agriculture, and the mission for sustainable habitat. These are important missions which we have launched and which will address both the adaptation needs and, in some sense, the need for mitigation also. But the other 2 important missions, that is the solar mission and the mission on enhanced energy efficiency, I think are 2 unique missions. We have already heard several times that the target which India has very boldly announced of scaling up significantly our dependence on renewable energy is indeed a laudable effort. And apart from changing considerably the profile of our energy consumption, it will also lead to a lot of mitigation action. Similarly, the National Mission on Enhanced Energy Efficiency, I think, is an important mission which will lead to many industrial sectors, 8 of them already identified, many more to be identified, where the specific energy consumption in these industries has to be brought down. Apart from this, many new initiatives and new areas have already been identified. And I'm saying all this because we are not waiting for 2020 when the INDCs will become operative. We are acting right now. And we do want that many of these programs have meaningful and effective outcomes even before 2020. Now, in terms of preparing the INDCs, we have launched a major consultation process with all stakeholders, because this, we believe, is an exercise in which all stakeholders are involved, the private sector is involved. We have 29 states who have already prepared their state action plans on climate change. They have to be taken on board, and we have to now see how the actions which they have proposed can actually be translated into targets, which can be reflected in INDC. And we are very confident that we would be declaring our targets well before the expected time, that is before the Paris Agreement. With reference to INDC, I find that my clock has been reset, so I don't know how much time.
About 2.5.
Well, the point, I think, which we must recognize about INDCs, and I'm drawing upon a phrase which has been used in the Lima Agreement, and that is that the expectation is that INDC should be fair and ambitious. So the point is what is fair, and the point is what is ambitious. According to our understanding, equitable is fair. And according to the dictionary, ambitious means something which you're determined to succeed. So we are determined to succeed. But ambitious also means something which is difficult to achieve. And we must recognize where the difficulty arises from. And that is where I think the world together will have to deepen its understanding, recognize the difficulties which developing countries have, whether it is in terms of achieving the Human Development Index, whether it is in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, It is meant to bridge the huge development deficit which exists in the country, the right to energy, the right to clean drinking water. These are all basic necessities which the country is striving for and for which we need to deploy our resources. So whether the difficulty arises on account of balancing the need for development and balancing the need for maintaining a clean environment, for which you need finances, for which you need technology, I think these are things which we need to recognize and address. I think the time for debate is over. The time for action is on. And the way I look at it is that this is a tremendous opportunity for the global community to demonstrate its resolve, that together we will make this happen. And we see the INDCs not as a tabulation of targets. I think INDC is an instrument of trust. We can make the INDCs comprehensive and do away with a lot of apprehensions which exist in the mind of different parties who have been wedded to their positions. And they should take a step forward and understand that how we can, in a very harmonious manner, address the issues of climate change. I would like to draw the attention of everybody that both the SDG and the climate change INDCs also contain in them the essential issue of means of implementation. And I think we would do well to recognize that and address that. Finally, since I have to stop here, I would just like to remind everybody and myself that in the 1919 declaration of the ILO, I think a very powerful expression was used, that poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity everywhere. And I think this spirit should always be at the back of our mind when we chart our path for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashok. Since we have the benefit of having you here, and a question that is perhaps also intriguing in terms of beginning to deepen our understanding on the adaptation imperative that is coming, can I ask you a question? Has India, for example, been able to undertake an assessment of coastal erosion and sea level rise for its very, very long coastlines that it has, or perhaps on another level in terms of an enormous nation, what actually is an adaptation horizon? Just in 1 minute, perhaps an example of, are we still at the beginning of this kind of work, or is there already a level of, let's say, consolidation?
Excellent, because this is an area which we have already identified. We have 3 projects which are going on in different states, coastal states. These projects were launched as a pilot, both for adaptation and taking some mitigation measures because of the vulnerability being faced by the coastal states. But as you say, that we have a almost 8,000 kilometer coastal line. And one of the new initiatives that have been identified in the last meeting of the Prime Minister's Council is indeed to take this project forward and cover all the states.
Ashok. Let me now turn and invite our other speakers, and perhaps I will briefly introduce the panel as a whole. And don't worry, Naoko is not running away because of anything we have said. She has to, unfortunately, go to another meeting. Naoko, thank you very much for joining us. I will invite, in the following order, now our other panelists to add some of their perspectives with their particular vantage point or also experience, beginning with Mr. Hideaki Domichi, Senior Vice President of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, then followed by Dr. Peter Holmgren, who is the Director General of the Center for International Forestry Research, CIFOR, and then followed by Professor Nebojša Nakicinovic, the Deputy Director of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and amongst many of his other functions, also Professor of Energy Economics at Vienna University of Technology. And last, but as always, not at all least, His Excellency, Mr. Michel Rentenaar, who is the Netherlands Climate Ambassador, and in many ways, I think will provide an excellent pulling the threads together as you are supposed to in Paris this September. So let me now turn to Mr. Domichi. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Achim. Allow me to speak looking at this memo, because I'm under very, very heavy pressure to speak and address this huge issue in 4 or 5 minutes. We, I think Japan, also take seriously the fifth report of IPCC. The agreement we are looking for in Paris is the agreement under the convention applicable to all parties with legal force, one way or another. Submission of intended nationally determined contributions by all countries is regarded, therefore, as an essential element leading to the agreement. Japan will submit the INDC as early as possible and is prepared to assist developing countries to formulate their own INDC. We should aim at the realization of low-carbon society and are willing to cooperate with the developing countries, introducing the Japanese various related technologies. For this purpose, we hosted for the first time what we called Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, a kind of Davos economic forum in the field of energy and the environment, and will continue to host this forum every year to accelerate the innovation. We are also promoting to conclude a joint crediting mechanism, and forest preservation is another important contribution we can make. National adaptation plan is also very important, and we will promote to convene a global adaptation network forum in Panama this March. At the same time, we host the third UN conference on disaster risk reduction in Sendai. With regard to the financial contributions, besides our bilateral cooperation, we will make a contribution of $1.5 billion to Green Climate Fund, subject to the approval of the Japanese Parliament. Then, what will or can JICA do and will do? First of all, we would like to improve our capacity to forecast the climate change for future and its impact, utilizing Earth observation technologies and in cooperation with various international or regional initiatives, such as Asian Water Cycle Initiative, or Global Agriculture Monitoring Initiatives, or the Global Adaptation Network. The degree of the preciseness of the forecast is already credible, but can be improved and downscaled. And if we can incorporate the result of these forecasts into the national development policy, such as land use plan, water management, selection of more climate adaptive seas, or various master plans, we believe that we can greatly enhance adaptation capabilities. We are already working together with the developing countries and are committed to further capacity development. Incidentally, Japan will launch a satellite to observe the global emission of greenhouse gas in 2017. This satellite will measure the emissions from the countries in Asia, especially from the big cities, and based upon these observations, we are in a better position to make proposal of how to reduce it. Secondly, in implementing various development projects that will cooperate, we are trying as much as possible to introduce the best Japanese technologies that will make a difference. Finally, incidentally, we recognize that there are tendencies that compared with mitigation, adaptation is given lower priorities in allocating global resources. Therefore, in the drawing of master plans for the city in particular, we are encouraging to promote the project that will bring comfort to the city dwellers and at the same time has an effect of adaptation. We expect that urbanization will accelerate fast, but most big cities in Asia are located along the coastline and vulnerable to climate change. Therefore, it is especially important for the cities to make the pre-disaster investment for adaptation. But in reality, we know that this is not so easy. Therefore, we are promoting the concept of build back better in the disaster risk reduction. And finally, importance of global partnership. We welcome the establishment of GCF. GCF is supposed to engage with the national implementing entities of the developing countries with whom we are already working together. By enhancing the coordination, centering the national implementing entities, we hope that we can scale up our own project. Thank you.
A very significant commitment by Japan, both through its government and its people, but also through JICA. And I'm sure in the discussion, maybe some very specific questions will come back in a moment. Thank you, Mr. Domichi. Peter Holmgren, you have the floor.
One key message is becoming clear, and that is that we cannot expect climate change mitigation and adaptation to be done in isolation. They need to be fully integrated with the social and economic development. And in other words, climate and sustainable development efforts must be combined. That's why 2015 is so important and exciting. I was asked to comment on forests and landscapes. And first on forestry, the main opportunity. You asked for opportunities. The first opportunity I see is to take forests out of the environment corner where it has been throughout the MDG period. Instead, we must realize contributions of forestry across all sustainable development goals: poverty, health, food security, water, trade, energy. CIFOR research has shown that as much as a quarter of livelihoods of rural people depend on forests. And of course, we must realize that forests are securing our environment way beyond keeping carbon away from the atmosphere. For example, in regional climate regulation, and an excellent example of that is the droughts in Brazil that many are connecting to the loss of forest cover. This is an interesting example where mitigation and adaptation efforts can be combined. So in other words, we must not only see forests as carbon sinks. This may easily also become a money sink. Instead, consider forestry an economic sector with great potential to contribute both to development and climate needs. So let me then put forests into landscapes together with agriculture and other land uses. How can we bridge artificial boundaries between sectors and artificial boundaries between international processes and find better combined solutions on the ground? This is what the landscape approach is about. And if it's appropriate to talk about elephants in the room when you're here, it seems to me that agriculture and the food system, as well as the broader contributions of forestry, continue to be underrepresented, both in the development and in the climate talks. And still, so much of our future depends on landscapes and the people in them. Without sustainable landscapes, there will be no sustainable development. Now, the opportunity for landscapes that I want to talk about is to scale up affordable, fair, and long-term finance for investments in sustainable production systems. Systems that both deliver economic return as well as enhanced ecosystem services, puts more carbon in vegetation and soils, and also uses less energy. These systems exist, but they have not always been promoted by policies, science, or the finance sector. Everyone talks about finance these days. We heard it through the past couple of days too. We put our hope in the private finance sector to steer investments in the right direction, and that much smaller volumes of public finance can help leverage this. But scaling up sustainable development finance into the trillions that we need for the land use sectors cannot happen unless attractive financial products are there. Products that provide, first of all, good return on investments, have acceptable transaction costs, and cost-effective verification of sustainability outcomes. I'm optimistic that we can find these solutions and connect large-scale investors in the cloud with smallholder producers on the ground. But we need to keep it simple and focused. At CIFOR, we're taking these opportunities into what we call a landscape fund concept, a new focus of our research. And to me, this topic is possibly one of the better shots we have to move fast enough, both on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation in an integrated way. Thank you.
Since you were so efficient, let me just take 30 seconds in a quick question. In a sense, in trying to make forests be recognized as so much more, can all of these benefits really be viewed in an additive sense? I mean, you can get a lot of cubic meters of wood out of a forest, but then you don't necessarily have the ecosystem services, you don't necessarily have some of the other benefits. How far have we come in being able to make the theoretical values that you have just described also become real in a management sense?
Well, in one way, forestry has always been about multiple benefits. It's nothing new. What we have to look at now is how to incorporate a wider range of needs of ecosystem services, of climate change mitigation and adaptation benefits from the forest. I think we need to be realistic and say that, no, we can't get it all. But on the other hand, we shouldn't also say that it's only one thing at a time, because we always have a combined interest in what the forest can deliver. The example of Brazil is very interesting. You could have more carbon in the forest, and that would also probably have helped to adapt to the drought situations.
Thank you. Just a very brief, perhaps, spotlight on where some of the debate will have to happen. So from one of the world's leading experts on forests to one of the world's leading experts on energy and many other things, Naki, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be back at the Delhi Summit. It has been a pleasure previous times as well, and I think this summit is going really well. I would like to first join those who have said that 2015 will be a critical year. I truly believe it's going to be a critical year for climate mitigation, adaptation, for sustainable development, for energy for all, access to energy. And but the challenge is probably a century-scale challenge. I think this year will be hopefully a beginning of the big transformation, but I do believe that we need a deep social transformation to achieve the necessary decarbonization and adaptation. So perhaps one could say even a revolution will be required. Maybe the right metaphor might be industrial revolution that we have behind us. I think one of the great achievements there was the replacement of human and animal labor by fossil energy, but it came at a cost. With a huge development, we have a 100 trillion economy, but also the big environmental cost, increasing planetary pressures. So I hope what's ahead of us could be called sustainability transformation or revolution, the one that will liberate the planet from our intrusion. And for that, deep carbonization is required. So I would just like to first comment on that. Most of the studies, including the global energy assessment that we concluded with 300 authors, IPCC fifth assessment report just finished, or the GAP report of UNEP, I think they all report in unison that to achieve stabilization of climate at 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level, we need to drive the emissions down to 0 in 50 years. Which corresponds to cumulative emissions of about 1,000 billion tons that we still have as a budget, as an allowance. To put that in perspective, we have emitted so far twice as much. So we have only 1/3 to go, and we have to use it really well. And one of the important things that I wanted to address is the question of efficiency. Efficiency is a key for achieving both decarbonization and more equity and access to services, including forestry, ecosystem services, and energy services in the world. The efficiency, I think many of the studies that look at the 2-degree stabilization indicate that efficiency could bring about 40% of the emissions reductions. But not only that, it's also catalytic to other goals for achieving universal access to energy, for increasing the non-fossil shares, and so on. However, one of the challenges of efficiency improvement is that it's not only, at least in the energy area, but I would be surprised if it were different in forestry, it's not only a technical issue within the energy system, how to improve individual technology. It has a lot to do with the end use. It's actually what we do with the energy services to provide mobility, to provide comfortable buildings, industrial products that we need. And this is the challenge, because that means that we need to change behavior to achieve those challenges. And so technology, institutions, behavior, that all goes together, and this is why I'm calling for a really fundamental social transformation. But it has to be said that efficiency is one of the cheapest measures in general, and this is why it's so important. So let me just conclude by observing why I think 2015 is challenging. You can even consider it perhaps to be a game changer. The US recent announcement, I think, is almost equally ambitious, or perhaps equally ambitious as the European one, and inconsistent, according at least to my assessment, consistent with the future of stabilizing climate to 2 degrees. Then we had the Chinese pledge to reach peak of emissions in 2030. Together, I think this is already a beginning of a game changer, and I hope that Paris, there will be more forthcoming. Then at least we'll be nudging ourselves in the right direction of achieving 2 degrees, and thereby also reducing the need for adaptation. Just in conclusion, I think if Paris is really as successful as I hope, then the work will still be ahead. And I think at least for us in science, for example, for JICA, for IPCC, for UNEP gap report, we will need to assess what those bottom-up pledges really mean, because they'll be all different. What does that mean for the world? What still needs to be done in the way of implementing those strategies? But I look forward to a successful agreement in Paris, and more mitigation and less adaptation, but we need both.
Thank you, Naki. Also to you, a very brief question with a very brief answer. You have outlined all these areas where action is possible and could be happening. You spend much of your life articulating, researching, presenting the factual imperative. What is the most likely bet you would place on why these things could actually move in 2015?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, but just to be brief, I'm hopeful not only because there is energy behind it, and one could almost argue that Paris might be the last chance to have a proper agreement, but I think what is really changing is a better understanding that the co-benefits of that are huge. The co-benefits of human health for reducing air pollution, co-benefits also in the area of water, if we do that right, in the food production. And I think that can be the game changer as well. So I think until now we focused quite a lot on costs, but we did focus too little on actually benefits that also can catapult the humanity maybe in the next revolution.
Very interesting way of summarizing what has changed perhaps between Copenhagen. It's not the front lines, it's not the negotiating parameters. Maybe it is the co-benefits that will shift the ambition. And what you just said is interesting, and some of you might know UNEP is headquartered in Kenya. Kenya has just published an analysis of its energy prices over the last 30 years. And being an economy that today has 90% renewables in terms of generating its electricity, precisely because of the renewables, the price of electricity to consumers is coming down and access to energy is increasing. The co-benefits alive and in action and documented in an economy such as Kenya. Michel, you heard just now also, target is, in some ways, if we take the science seriously and the progression that we see right now, 50 years, plus 10, maybe a few less, to reach a world in which we essentially have zero net carbon emissions. What makes you go into the negotiating cycle this year and work towards an outcome in Paris that we all know, as Christiana put it, will not turn on a dime the entire climate ambition, but is sufficient to actually make us progress towards an ability to say, yes, that target remains a real prospect?
Sure. Well, in the interest of time, let's run through a few things that where we came from, and it was mentioned by others as well. Let's leave the science behind us. That is the one we've won. There's no serious negotiator in the world anymore who would be a climate skeptic. That's one. The new climate economy report by President Calderon, massive breakthrough, I think. The proof that climate action and economic growth don't bite each other, but in fact you need both. You need climate action in order to retain economic growth. So we are now basically moving into what I would call the period of opportunities. Opportunities, of course, in terms of development cooperation. We can do this in a very different way. Growth can be green and doesn't have to be black and lock us in to emission patterns, let's say, that will keep us tortured for a century to come. But also in terms of health and in security, there are many, many co-benefits, let's say. So that is the period of possibilities. It is also an economic possibility in trying to rebuild our societies in a much more resilient way. For instance, just look at New York. The Hurricane Sandy there cost $60 billion US. It would have cost them a fraction to prepare themselves a little better. And as a Dutchman who lives in a country which is 70% below water, I think we can say something about dikes. It would have cost them a fraction to prepare a little better. So the cost of prepare is much less than the cost of repair. So all of that leads to a certain state of mind, let's say, and perhaps since I am one of those negotiators that will have to somehow come up with a deal later on in the year in Paris, as you so kindly said, let me just give you 5 points that I see are crucial in terms of these negotiations. First of all, we need to get out of that, well, sorry for any disrespect to those who did Copenhagen, but we need to get out of this Copenhagen state of mind. Copenhagen was somewhat of a zero-sum game, let's say, where we're playing cards and you say, you did percentage, you do that percentage. That is not going to get us a deal. So we somehow need to get together behind a long-term goal that could have, of course, percentages in it, but most importantly, it needs to have a long-term goal. Where are we moving towards? In my view, and many others, that would be an end goal of climate neutrality. Secondly, we need to somehow get out of this debate of what legal form this thing should take. I believe, and many with me in the negotiating world think it needs to be hybrid, a little bit top-down, legally binding, a lot of it bottom-up, and where countries can decide themselves what is their way of dealing with this nationally. That's the second issue. Thirdly, we need to get rid of, and this is a Western perspective, but I'm going to mention it anyway, we need to get rid of the firewall that was created in 1992. The world, of course, has common but differentiated responsibilities. There's no discussion there. We definitely support that, but they are not static. They are changing. There are already 28 countries, let's say, on the list that was then called the developing countries, who have a higher GDP per capita than, for instance, a country like Romania in the European Union, and they have to abide by all the strict laws that there are. Fourthly, and this I think is crucial, there is, I usually call it a triangle. We obviously need to mitigate. We need to somehow get the emissions of greenhouse gases down. But there is also a very obvious need, even within the 2-degree scenario, of adaptation. Even now, today, already, there is a need for adaptation. So that political parity needs to be recognized, and I think it is essential to have that in the agreement as well. And then I come to the third leg of the triangle, and that is means of implementation. That is, of course, money. That has to do with capabilities, that has to do with technologies, and at the moment that triangle isn't closed. And it is up to the negotiators, but not just the negotiators, the entire world around, and that's why a summit like this is so important, to have all these side discussions, let's say. We need to close that triangle between these three things. We need to ensure that the developing world trusts us, that we will deliver, of course, in terms of climate finance, but we also need to find the trust back on the other side that emissions will go down. And that's the only way to close the triangle. And finally, and I see the red light, we can't do this alone. Governments cannot do this alone. We need to have the involvement of what I call non-state actors. The ambition of companies, cities, subnational authorities is absolutely crucial. They are the ones out there already changing a lot. Some of the other speakers spoke about this as well. But there's one very seriously thing missing. They are not in the room where it matters when the negotiating texts are made. Lima was a change, I think, in a little bit. The first time in COP history, where there, at least in the plenary, there was discussion between ministers and some of those non-state actors, CEOs, mayors, etc. And we need to do this in Paris as well, and towards Paris as well. We need to know and how to bind in their ambition and their action, and then I think we will get an agreement that will make a difference.
Michel, thank you very much. If I can just alert the panel, because I'll turn now to the audience. We'll take 4 or 5 interventions, maximum 1 minute, please, if you can raise your hands. And to the panel, I will turn one more time at the end, 1 minute each. Perhaps with a practical illustration out of your careers of where you have seen some of what we have just described in analytical, hypothetical, or possibility terms actually happen. Would be very useful, be it at the global or at the national level, speaking to this ambition of transformation with which we began with Naoko, and then reflecting perhaps on some of the arenas in which we have just talked. Can I just turn to the room? Is there anybody who would like to react, to comment? I'll start here.
I wish just, we are working with grassroots level people and children. So to the distinguished panelists, my question, how do we define mitigation and adaptation, not to the policymakers, but to the grassroots level people, so that they can bring about a change in the society?
Very tough question. Thank you. The gentleman there, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is to the ambassador from Netherlands. And
a bit louder, please.
My question is to the environment ambassador from Netherlands, or anybody else who wishes to take it up. I heard you say, sir, that the strategy going forward should be a little bit top-down and a lot of bottom-up. The problem with this top-down approach is that I hope we are not creating another situation like Southern Europe, whereby lumping the sustainable development, financing for sustainable development, together, the climate financing, which is poor, and the economic and social development financing, which is also poor, but not that poor. But by clubbing it all together in one single black box, I think people in developing countries are anxious that you may actually be pushing us into a situation like Southern Europe. And that is not useful for anybody, I would imagine.
Thank you very much. The third hand was somewhere over here. Here, yes, thank you very much. Microphone over here, please. Yes, thank you. And then the fourth and fifth hands were around there, yes.
Thank you, Achim. My name is Pavel Kabatiasa, director. I would like to respond and challenge maybe Michael Rentenar and Naki to start discussion about a statement, Michel, you made. Let's leave science behind, it's done. Let's have action on the agreement. I agree, we have the action, but I believe that the notion of partnership needs to be taken also to the science and policy and implementation. We have seen how everything is changing as we speak. Boundary condition change. I think science is ready to step up and to be partners to the implementation process. I would like you to address that, to maybe with Naki together, what you think of that partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Yes, gentleman over there.
Hi. My name is Anindya Bhattacharya. I'm the senior manager with Ernst & Young, and I'm also working in climate change for last maybe 10 years. So my question is to the distinguished panelists that the world has seen that from Copenhagen and last 20 years, actually the world took to understand now that the climate change and sustainable development should be linked together, and this is indispensable part. So I just like to ask this distinguished panel that what measures the world has taken to ensure that we are not going to lose this last opportunity in Paris. What the world had a lot of hopes in last Copenhagen, but how the world is taking initiative to make sure that this is not going to miss in Paris. So this is one question. And the second one is that in the context of the now the declining fuel price, the international crude price, how this energy efficiency is going to be looked into in next couple of years, whether this falling price has any implication on Paris.
Thank you very much. I think it was somebody near you who had the fifth hand up. Yes, the lady behind you. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Jay Sargent, and I'm here with UNEP. And my question is for Peter Holmgren. And I found his concept of landscape fund concepts very interesting, and I was wondering if he could elaborate further on it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a dangerous invitation with only 5 minutes left, but I know
Hello.
Peter has been extremely disciplined in it.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes?
I have a question.
Who?
Yeah, the second.
30 seconds because you're number 6 now, and I'm going to get into trouble.
Yeah, I'm Ritika Agarwal from Indian Institute of Remote Sensing. I have a question. It's like every country aims to reduce the carbon emissions. So the one approach would it be to go to increase the area of forest. So that would be, I would like to know how do we ensure food security for the projected 9.6 billion world population by 2050, that is project.
Thank you very much. Let me this time start from Naki. You have a couple of curveballs, including from your boss. But you have 60 seconds if you can squeeze it into that, please.
Okay, see what I can squeeze in. I would actually like to address 2 issues. One is the bottom-up deal, and then the question what role science has to play, and perhaps also on the oil price. So first on the bottom-up deal, I think that's connected with science, because if we are going to have voluntary pledges in the deal, which I think that's the direction where it's going, then there will have to be a type of assessment and analysis to really understand what is achieved by that and what still needs to be done. So it's an iterative process. I think we are at the beginning, as I said before, and not at the end. For example, we will need roadmaps, both regional, global roadmaps that are based on the national pledges. And so I think this is a big role for the international community and the analytic community to provide the information. And in the few more seconds that are left, let me just comment on the oil price, because this is really an important development. One can almost argue that if you look at Europe, United States, that the shale gas revolution has generated a bifurcation between the strategies in Europe and US. Even though we all have a portfolio of energy, US gas has replaced coal. In our case, in case of Europe, we have renewables coming into the market, reducing the emissions. Now, the low oil price will, of course, reshuffle that landscape. There is no doubt about it. But my expectation is that the low oil price will lead to a huge cost pressure of reducing the costs and might affect, like the high oil price, all of the energy carriers. So I'm quite hopeful that the long-term strategy will not be fundamentally affected by that.
Thank you, Naki. Peter.
60 seconds?
If you can.
Thank you. People on the ground are in charge. Of course, the adaptation happens from there and not from the top. So I think it's the aspiration and drive from the ground that we need to focus on. That comes back to the landscape fund. Science will not be left behind, but maybe the decision makers need to put science on the side and actually make decisions instead of waiting for science to come up with the solutions. Paris will maybe be the last opportunity for the trust in the multilateral system, but I don't think it will be the last chance to fix climate change, to be honest. Landscape fund. Let me put it like this. We need 3 things to turn the huge opportunities of land use as an economic activity into an economic activity that delivers wealth as well as mitigates and adapts to climate change. One is much improved financial infrastructure that connects smallholders with big investors. Secondly, we need to know more science, more research, more about what practices on the ground deliver sustainability outcomes. And third, we need to have cost-efficient verification systems of those sustainability outcomes that are simple enough to be understood and accepted by everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Ashok.
Well, first, top-down. I think the fact that we are all recognizing that we need to act is top-down enough. How much you have to act, I think that will have to be nationally determined. It has to come out of the circumstances which prevail in the country. It has to come out of the resources which can be allocated. So that is one. The second is that I do see a great role for the private sector in this. But the $100 billion that we are talking about is too small a pool in which the huge private sector resource should be merged. So the $100 billion, I think, is a promise to be kept, and it is more or less like a seed capital which will catalyze the private sector investment. And on the issue of common but differentiated responsibility and the fact that differentiation is a dynamic concept, yes, I think the world has changed in the last 20 years and it will continue to change. But we need to also at the same time recognize the burden of development which many countries have to bear. And while they may have grown, but the huge unaccomplished task and the resources required for that, I think will have to be kept in view. And that is where the principle of common but differentiated responsibility will continue to be relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. The question from Pavel on science, I think Peter answered it perfectly, so I totally agree with that answer. On the question from the sir about top-down and leaving anyone behind, it is quite the opposite, actually. If you look at the Kyoto Protocol, I often call that perfect is the enemy of good. Lawyers love that treaty. It is a very rigid treaty, however. It only covers about 40% of the emissions in the world. Countries that signed it stepped out of it. So it's like a nice little perfect thing, but that is not necessarily give us what we're going to need. What we need in Paris is an agreement that includes everyone, the broadest possible participation. And in that, climate neutrality is actually a crucial one. And then I get to your question. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and she asked me, what do you do? And when I talk to her, she lives in the Netherlands, rather cold country. When I talk to her about 2 degrees more, she says, great, I want that. So it's not necessarily so easy to explain these kind of things, or a 40% target. What is that? You know, it's not easy to do. But when I tell her, we're aiming to create a deal for the entire world where we agree that we're all on the same path towards climate neutrality, towards stopping hurting our climate with our economic activities, then her eyes lit up and she says, I understand that. That is something that I can sell. That is something that I can tell to anyone, whether she's 14 or 48. Any age, doesn't matter. So I think that is the answer to your question.
Thank you, Michelle. Jakob.
Well, actually, I agree with all the previous speakers. And so therefore, I'm going to speak our own experience, what we're doing in India, or what we are trying to do in India. I think India, in terms of the energy consumption, probably India will outpace that of China as early as 2020. That means and also towards 2050, we expect that India will become the 3rd largest economy in the world. So that means not only India, but also most of the Asian countries have to grow. And in order to grow, they need a lot of energy. And therefore, as I said, in the national plan, it is very important to take into account what is the best energy mix, for your country. And this is what we are doing in Japan, because after the devastation of nuclear, I think that the government has, we have to shut down all the nuclear. And we have to, because of this, we have to import a lot of the natural gas and oil, and that costs us heavily, and that affects our own economy. So all of these, are taken into account. But what we are aiming for is the low carbon society. And actually, beyond that, what we are trying to do is hydrogen society. That is actually zero emission. We don't know, when we'll be able to complete it, but we are already starting it in the automobile industries. But the importance of this, this subject is not only for the growth for the country, but for the people. For instance, in India, the reason why, solar panel or solars, promoting, that is because of renewable, but at the same time for the people. In order to bring electricity off grid to the villages, this is, maybe, renewable energy would be a key. So I think, there are lots of, questions interlinked, but I think, what we're trying to do is to come to an agreement, come to a framework where all the parties, would be applicable.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it in 55 minutes, a quick journey across the spectrum of climate change mitigation, adaptation. If I may just offer one parting thought, I think what you have heard here this afternoon is that the world has not failed to act on climate change. And I would also say, Peter, yes, processes are difficult. Many describe Copenhagen as a failure. I actually don't describe it at all as a failure. I think it just didn't meet its very ambitious target, but what actually happened after Copenhagen proves how important it is to bring the world together around the table year after year after year with the latest science, the latest analysis, the latest recognition of co-benefits and other drivers that will allow us to move forward. And I think the price of oil is going to be a very interesting experience this time around. The world has spent the last 50 to 100 years being held hostage literally, to the price of a single commodity in terms of its economy. And yet here we are, living through a period of just 1 decade in which the oil price shoots up from around $30 to over $100 and back down to 50 again. And the world is beginning to say, this is crazy, this is not real, and we're not going to let our future economic strategy and our future be determined by this price volatility. From there emerges some very interesting thinking also on the climate change front. 30 years or 20 years from now, the debate in India will no longer be about coal versus renewables. Coal will have left the center stage of India's energy economy, one outlook. Shale gas will have been a passing fad in 1 or 2 or 3 particular markets around the world. We have seen the coming and going of technologies, not because we have run out of stuff, but because better options arose. We didn't stop using stone wheels because we ran out of rocks, as the analogy goes, but because better things came along. And I think this is where it gets very interesting. Are the co-benefits, are the economic, social, and developmental imperatives of a nature that will actually make the world take these big steps forward? And in that sense, let us look to Paris, as I think Christiana said, not as the one final attempt at trying to get the world onto a 2-degree path, but as the next vital, important, and ambitious step towards enabling the world to accelerate action towards a climate neutral or zero net emissions reality somewhere in the second half of the century. And God forbid if the world is not able to give that signal in Paris, because then adaptation doesn't become something that we discuss as a necessity, it becomes an impossible challenge. With this thought, may I thank all the panelists, invite you with a round of applause to thank them for being here. Thank you for this afternoon.
I'd like to make an announcement here that Terry and Terry University has been recognized as the Capacity Building Hub Center, Sustainable Energy for All, or SE4 All initiative. And the hub, it engages with stakeholders across the energy value chain on the one hand and also works through collaborative approach on the other. The web-based portal of the hub is a global platform to deliver online training programs as well as curated knowledge products. And we'd like to show you just a brief video to explain a little bit what this initiative looks like. Let's watch. So there you have it, the brief video explained to us what it's like, and I want to ask Professor Achim Steiner to help us launch this capacity building hub portal.
You see, this is...
You did it! So this is the
yeah.
official launch of the Capacity Building Hub portal. We were all part of history, I guess. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank
and
you,
thank you very
Raisa.
much for a great job launching it.